Hello, I'm Ibrahim Imam, and welcome to this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast, in which we will continue our discussion of functional neurological disorder, better known as FND. And in this episode, I'm joined by Robert Wilson Thomas, and we'll be discussing his memoir, interestingly titled FND Lessons from a Rather Eventful Life, Bipolar Diabetes Cancer, What Next? Hopefully nothing next. By way of introduction, Robert is Welsh by birth, but as he has lived in Ireland since 2001, he now tends to identify as Irish Welsh, although native Irish people still regard him as a blow-in. He's a practicing Buddhist and has been a barrister since 1977, although his first degree was in chemical engineering. He describes himself further as autistic, bipolar, diabetic, an alcoholic in recovery, vegetarian, a cancer survivor twice. And relevant to today's discussion, he has had FND for about 8 years now. Robert retired from formal employment in 2017, but since mid-2018, he has been a director, co-chair, and legal advisor to FND Hope International. This is a global charity dedicated to support and advocate on behalf of people with FND and their families. I will ask a few more questions about what FND does later on. He said his work with FND has been as absorbing as it is varied and rewarding. Despite all the diagnosis and symptoms he has, he lives a full life, enjoys his life, is active fully, and pushes to extend his horizons, occasionally succeeding. And he describes his robust sense of humor, which I guess is going to come through during the discussion. Robert, welcome to the Neurology Lounge podcast. I'm very glad that you honored my invitation and you could join me today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Abraham, and I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you very much. I usually ask the first question is why anybody writes a book, and in your case, why did you write this book?
Well, I suppose if I look back, I was doing a lot of work. I still am doing a lot of work on the peer support groups for FND Hope, and a lot of the questions and subject matters that came up again and again. And I found, hang on a moment, I've dealt with that, and not necessarily through FND. I've dealt with something similar in the past. So the natural progression from that was to say, well, how did I deal with something that was particularly challenging in the past? It's almost like a question of what would Batman do when faced with this problem. And the incredible thing is that almost everything that we learn through our lives is of purpose. And with FND, you've really got to dig deep to find the answers within you sometimes, and then to apply them. So it made sense to share on a wider scale rather on what is rather a one-to-one and hit and miss way of writing a book. And so it means about 3 people have read it now, but instead of just the 1 or 2 on the website, on the Facebook groups.
Well, hopefully we'll give it a wide publicity today.
Very nice too. If it helps the wider FND community,
yes,
and goodness knows there are plenty of us, then I'm all for that, and that's good.
So will I say that altruism is kind of one of the reasons you wrote the book, then, is to help others?
Yeah, it's I suppose vanity is another reason, but yeah, there's an element of altruism involved. I think anybody who is involved in a charity, there are 2 elements of it. You say the altruism, there's also a necessary element that you have to leave your ego at the door. And that's very important, I feel. And a lot of people, I say a lot, some people I found volunteer for the charity in the mindset of, well, that'll look good on my CV. And unfortunately, they're not the people you want to hang around. And often they don't anyway.
They move on quickly.
Exactly. They stay for 6 months, a year, stir a bit, and then move on.
I was struck by one thing you said about writing the book. You said this book is to highlight elements of my fight to reclaim my ability to function as close as I can to my former life.
Yeah.
Did you find writing the book also cathartic? Was it a form of reflection on your own experiences?
Tremendously, because it's spurred a number of other things since then, not just on FND. I've written another book on my cancer experience, and that was a fun experience, I can tell you. Well, it started off with being a nuisance about missing a summer cycling, but it ended up on being quite a life-changing, literally, as they gave me 2 weeks to live at one stage, and not a great likelihood of living longer than 5 years, but that was about nearly 20 years ago. So sorry, Doc, you don't always get it right, and the predictions aren't always quite as bad as.
Beating the odds.
I've also written, more recently, I've written about my neurodiversity. Now, you mentioned the bipolar, but I've added autism to that, and certainly FND changes the mindset very quickly. And all of these things together, it's autobiographical.
Yeah.
It's sometimes very painful to revisit those memories, but having revisited them, you can sometimes, or you should be able to put them in perspective, which is the past, and then either move on or deal with them in the present tense, such as you need to. And then the books that I'm working on at present, one is about what I did in the Tour de France. I did the amateur, what they call a randonneur tour in '82. And I'm writing that at present. It's nothing but pure pleasure to write that because I remember everything. And the more I write, the more I remember. And so at some stage, I've got to take a blue pencil to that one. I'm also writing about my most recent 4 lives that I can remember. I keep getting emotional flashbacks to these events, and they're difficult sometimes because the emotions associated with the various lives does come out as emotions today. And that's quite difficult to deal with sometimes. But I think that this sort of connection with the past is important for each and every one of us. For example, I'm sure we've met before. Now, that may sound like a sweeping statement, but why would we here on Wednesday afternoon be talking unless we'd made a connection somewhere? It's it's a great philosophy. We should really sit down around a roaring fire and discuss this with a nice cup of tea or something and do that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's nothing that makes connections better than writing books. You kind of get a wider audience and you get
Much.
a neurologist like me inviting you to talk about one bit of it.
Yeah.
FND. But the bipolar aspect was there. And just before we delve into the FND, you started as a chemical engineer and then moved on. I've kept away from the adventurous life you've led in the questions I've set out. Was a lot of your pre-FND life dominated by the bipolar, do you think? This changing course.
Yeah, the revolving door that was employment mostly, that I could work as hard as I like, probably to mask the fact that I'm bipolar. And then one day, almost inevitably, somebody would find out. In one case, I went into a deep depression. Human resources, who had been told about the bipolar right at the start and just hadn't noticed or hadn't acted on it, they said, well, take time off. And of course, with the time off, when it became 3 weeks, 4 weeks, a month, they needed fitness to work certificates. So went to the company doctor, full interview, and he was quite happy that there was nothing wrong with being bipolar and working. But unfortunately, my manager didn't agree. And he fired me the day that he found out. And then made the absolutely astonishing statement, someone with manic depression, as it used, great dramatic title, manic depressive. Someone with manic depression cannot be an in-house lawyer. He lost the unfair dismissal case, by the way.
Rightly so, rightly so.
And rightly so. And this is before the protections for the minorities who are disabled or have an illness came into place in the UK. This was, of course, but it happened a couple of times after that as well. So when FND came along, I had a sort of idea of what might happen. You know, he's bipolar. Well, don't go near him.
I was going to take you back to November 2016. That was when that's when kind of the start of the FND, and it was linked to this removal of a kidney tumor.
Yeah.
What you were told was going to be a relatively minor operation. What happened to transform it into a trigger for FND? What happened?
Well, the tumor had come along through about a year and a half before that they noticed a couple of iffy patches during a fairly routine ultrasound on my stomach or something, and referred me to a hospital in Dublin, private hospital, and they said, well, there's not a lot to worry about at present. There are a couple of things they could develop, and over a year they grew, so I don't know. Come in, 2-hour operation, probably a little longer than 4 hours in recovery, and 4 days in the hospital to recover and home, and 3 months later everything would be fine. Plan A. So anyway, they decided that they would do the operation, and what I told them was that, look, 5-6 years earlier, 5-6 years ago, I had a keyhole operation to remove my gallbladder. And after that, my blood pressure, immediately after, in recovery, my blood pressure hit the ceiling. And they gave me painkillers, assuming that the cause of this elevated blood pressure was pain. And immediately I crashed. So I spent 2 days in ICU and I recovered. Now, the two anaesthetists, after, or one of the two, or both of them, after the one before, noted in the notes that there was no history with problems with anesthesia. Not quite what was recording in my medical notes. And indeed, they didn't get in touch with the other hospital to find out what the heck went wrong last time. They went ahead. I came out at the other end of the operation, woke up, and they said, "You in any pain?" I said, "Nope, I'm fine." And then predictably, my blood pressure went through the roof. The problem was that when my blood pressure hit the ceiling, they said, it must be pain. Even though I'd reported, I'm not in any pain. They gave me fentanyl, or one of these heavy dose painkillers, and I was out. And my heart stopped, my breathing stopped, so I was left alone in a ward, and they allegedly found me after about 40 minutes, although the notes are made up a lot later, as far as we can tell. I was rushed back to ICU, where I'd started to do this when I recovered. My hands were shaking around, what they call myoclonus, I believe, which is there. And I've got this abiding memory of screaming, "Stop it, hold my hands, stop me hitting myself," and which is not very nice. So that was the start. They put it down to a serotonin reaction it's not an uncommon event, a serotonin reaction, except this one was severe. And to explain what a serotonin reaction is. You could take an antihistamine or a tablet or something for hay fever, and you could get the shivers. That's a serotonin, or could be a serotonin reaction. In my case, they used me as a guinea pig and tried out about 30 odd different remedies over 48 hours, different meds over 48 hours, referred to Wikipedia for advice and followed it. And I was in ICU for about 7 days, 5, 6, 7 days, something like that. I haven't got a great recollection of that time. And then in the ward for 30 days, more or less. All the time they were saying, well, this is serotonin syndrome, which is absurd because once you take away the serotonin agents, in my case, the lithium and amlodipine was still there, it should go away by itself, but it didn't. So I was discharged on 23rd December 2016 with no diagnosis, no support, no game plan of action, no paperwork of any sort to support what I had. The consultant neurologist had concluded that my ADLs are normal, even though I'd walked into the hospital and had to be taken out in a wheelchair. And the only advice I got was to install a second handrail in the stairs at home. So there I was, Christmas Eve, and my wife and I had no idea at all what was happening. And I did see the neurologist again, and he, first of all, he mused about it being something called Lance-Adams syndrome, which is, you've got a look of, I don't believe it, I've never even heard of that on your face, which is about the same as the rest of the world, because only about 110 people, only 110, 120 cases have ever been reported worldwide. And it comes about when you have a severe reaction like an FND reaction after being revived from a heart attack, which was exactly what had happened. I got in touch quite by chance through looking at the internet with a guy in California who had Lance-Adams syndrome. And I keep wanting to call it Lance Armstrong syndrome, but that's quite different. But anyway, we had 2 or 3 emails exchanged, and it sounded as though he was experiencing much the same as I was experiencing. So I thought maybe I'm 1 in 120 or something ever, which was quite, I don't know if it was flattering, but it was quite interesting. I always said I was 1 in a million, but I'm 1 in 120. Well, that's a start. And I then saw the consultant at my own expense again after about 2 months. And he said, no, it's not Lance-Adams syndrome, even though he'd sent me for nerve conduction tests, and they were completely worthless because I couldn't stop shaking long enough for the nerve conduction thing. But the consultant there reckoned it could be Lance-Adams syndrome. And the consultant I saw, she said, no, it isn't, but he wouldn't give me a diagnosis. Safe to say, it was probably something functional.
Okay.
And that was the start of it. You know, it sounds like a horrendous way to get into an illness, but suddenly you're there feeling fine and great and looking forward to doing whatever you had to do in 10 days' time. And then you're sitting there unable to feed yourself or walk or stand or do any of those things. And that's a pretty steep learning curve, it's vertical learning curve.
It didn't respond to any of the myoclonus treatments that they must have given.
They tried me on some neurophysio, and that had no effect. And again, the consultant neurologist just disagreed with the physio. in that she said I wasn't making any improvement, and he crossed out her opinion. Despite seeing me only about twice or three times, or maybe four, during the 4 weeks, he said, no, I'm making good progress, which was absurd. What he wanted to say, what he was seen to be saying was, this is what I'd like to report, but it was wishful thinking. And, 8 years on, I'd like him to see what his normal activities of daily living look like. But they're my normal, they're mine now. So I can't go back to where I was.
And you talked about difficulty with balance and you're walking. Is that because of the shaking, or is it something else that came on?
No, it's just certainly the walking as such is related to the balance, in that I can be standing steady and still, and there's no problem with that, and then I'll fall over. Now, thankfully, a lot of that has gone away. The worst, there were 2 or 3 really bad ones about that. I was standing in the kitchen in the old house and fell backwards, put my head through the glass door of an oven. And I was sitting there with blood everywhere and my wife was out shopping. I had to call her and say, help. And she came back and found me there, and not quite in a pool of blood, but it was pretty traumatic. And we cleaned me up and so on, put a steri strip on the wounds on the head and so on. And on other occasions, I'd just been standing and gone. But the worst of it was in the first year, I suppose, I'd just plank, which was my body would stop and I'd fall. And as you know, normally when you fall, you put your hands out to stop you. And so none of that, no reaction, just oomph. Very dramatic for other people. Not very pleasant for me either. But I think in about the first 6 months, I had about 150 falls. Touch wood, I've gone without a serious fall for a couple of years now. I don't want it to, it's a matter of mindset and planning. If I'm going to walk, I've got the stroller. How am I going to get from here to there? And so on. That's the workaround that you do. You have to do a lot more projection of where you want to be, what you want to do, and so on.
One of the commonest or most recognizable forms of FND is functional seizures, and you also developed these associative seizures. How did they manifest in your case?
They tended to ramp up from a stressful situation, typically an argument. And the emotions get higher and higher, and it's almost like a dichotomy between, well, I'm trying to say something which is important to me, and I'm not saying it, and so far, and I just fall over. And it was complete dissociation. I couldn't move. I'd be on the floor. So typically it'd be in an emotional situation where the rhetoric would be ramped up perhaps, and I'd get more and more frustrated. And then ultimately the body would say, okay, I'm out to lunch, and over I go. And I could be stretched out on the floor for 15, 20 minutes, an hour. And the worst, I think, was about 4 or 5 hours. And during this time, I could feel, so I hadn't lost the ability of touch. I couldn't move, I couldn't talk, I could hear. And that's quite interesting when a first responder turns up who has no idea about non-epileptic seizures. And in my case, the one, you might say an ambulance gorilla, turned up, and he knew everything. Absolutely, you couldn't tell him anything. I said, when did he last have a drink? 1989. So he's not drunk? No, he's not. Is he epileptic? No, he's got non-epileptic seizures. Huh. Well, he's obviously acting the maggot or playing up. No, he's not. Happens often. So I'll show you. He's uh, he's faking it. And he got my thumb, and he dug his thumbnail into the white part on the base of this, what they call it, the moon. And of course, the body reacts to that because it's pain. He said, "There, he's faking it." And when I came to, I shared some wisdom about what it really was that he'd seen. And he said, "Well, I've never heard of it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist." And so it shows the widespread blanket of ignorance, another term I've used, and I continue to use, about the disorder. And you can look at things like Parkinson's. Before 1800, there was no Parkinson's. The symptoms are there, but Dr. Parkinson hadn't actually said, "Look, this is something that's common," and it gave his name to it. And this hasn't happened. It happened with ME. Yuppie flu, very unkindly, it was called in the 1990s. And then somebody said, "Well, this is actually a real disorder as a condition." So it gained a certain respectability. I won't say popularity because it isn't popular, but FND is the same. People think, "What the hell is that? I've never heard of it." So, and unfortunately, the people who hold the purse strings for research, for support, for rehabilitation, and everything else haven't heard of it either, and nor have the majority of doctors, sadly. And that's a problem, and that is part of the FND Hope mission, is to eradicate those mists of ignorance. So the people say, "Well, yeah, I know that, but I can't do anything about it. But I know somebody who can."
That's true.
And you're in an ideal position for that.
Yeah, it's, as you said, the older, you wrote in your book, the older doctors
Oh,
know less about it and to blame it on it's in your head.
absolutely right. Yes, and
You did say the younger ones are changing.
I think so. I think so. It's one of the failings of the medical establishment to do proper training in neurology. In Ireland, until quite recently, they only had 4 hours of lectures in the whole course, and not on FND, on all of neurology. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, 2 or 3 years back, they cut it to 2 hours. You're going to learn in 2 hours how to spell neurology, N-E-U, not N-U-E, and that's about it. So I frequently find doctors who say, "Well, no, I don't know about that." But then I have met one or two who've been absolutely brilliant. There was a psychiatrist in my mental health unit who'd done a rotation in neurology,
Okay.
and not only had met about FND, but took an interest. Our sessions were nothing to do with bipolar. They were an exchange of ideas. "What do you think this one? Or what about that?" And that was great. I feel that's a good way. And if indeed, from a credo with the what do you call it, the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, is well known. But if you look more deeply into the philosophy of Hippocrates, you'll find buried in there that there's a duty to teach other doctors, which is why you get the consultant and 5 or 6 juniors when he does his rounds and so on. He's passing on information, he's drawing out what they know and supplementing it. But more than that, there's a need to know the patient first and then understand the disease. So it's very much a holistic approach to any patient, and FND is one of those conditions that benefits greatly from that. If you understand the person, their driving forces, their motivations, their history often, and you can track back to either an incident or a series of incidents, which you might like to look at that. And now, after a neurologist has done that, he can say, I think you'd benefit from a course of counseling or some specialist neurophysio to address this or address that. And here in Ireland and to a large extent in Britain, it doesn't always happen like that.
I think the first thing is to accept there is a diagnosis, actually, and it's a neurological problem.
Yes, there are so many doctors who just look at the notes for 5 minutes, make a decision and act on it, or refuse to act on it. And that's not the best medicine as such.
Not the best medicine, and definitely not the best medicine for FND, which has more time to
yes, yes, yes. Well, this is where the holistic medicine comes in. There's a lot of alternative medicine that can help as well. And I feel that we've overlooked a lot of the ancient teachings. In my case, I'll try virtually anything that's legal or not completely illegal to try. If it just looks promising to help, I'll try. And one of the most astonishing things I found was I got this from another friend who also has FND, and she suggested a Shakti mat, which is a bed of nails, effectively a plastic bed of nails. Like a hell's teeth, you've got to be joking. But I thought, I'll go with this. It's I probably paid 60, 70 euros, about 50, 60 pounds for this mat. And it turned up, and there it was, about 2,000 little spikes and plastic. What the hell? So I laid it out in the bed, laid down in it, and God, it hurt like hell for about 15 or 20 seconds. And I sort of got used to it. Now, the theory is quite simple. When you have pain, the body, the brain, produces dopamine, which is a feel-good hormone. And so when you lie on this mat, it comes there. Now, I've gone to sleep on this mat, woken up 2-3 hours later, looking, completely spiky hold all over the back. But I relax and I do it every night. And if I miss a night, I know.
Notice.
So that's what I mean by an alternative approach. Now, no doctor's going to say, oh, go out and lie on a bed of nails.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's some form of acupuncture without the needles, I presume.
Well, acupressure, certainly. And that's a well-known therapy, pressing the wrist to relieve anxiety and so on. And I've had acupuncture in the past and it's been successful. So
there's so much we don't know about how the brain responds to things.
Of course. And it's the brain's, or rather the mind's response to what the brain does that is at the core of FND. In that the mind says, I want to, I'd like to, let's do, leaves it up to the body and the autonomic nervous system, the bit that does all the stuff so you have to think about it. Say when walking, you don't have to think, well, I'll lift this foot, I'll shift the weight, I'll move it. That's all done for you. The body's very clever like that. The brain is very clever. But in the case of FND, you form the idea, I'm going to walk. The signals send out, okay, body, walk. The signals go through the autonomic nervous system. They get to a bit in the brain called the amygdala, a little tiny peanut-shaped thing right in the middle, top of the brain cell. You know all this. And it's a great juggler. And it starts to juggle the signals. So by the time I want to walk gets the feet here dance like Bambi on ice. And you fall. That's, pretty much the way it is. It's like software. There's nothing wrong with the hardware, but the software looks good as well. And things go, as I said a lot earlier in joking, really good. To err is human. To make a really good lash up, you need a computer. It's the same. The body's computer system is, well, the real lash up, and with FND, we don't know what it is. Or as another analogy, you address a letter correctly, postcode and everything, you give it over to the post office, and it's delivered to the wrong address. Why does that happen? There's nothing wrong with the system. There's nothing wrong with the address. It just went the wrong place. FND is just like that.
That's an interesting model. That sounds very explanatory. And that can explain, I mean, one of the things about your FND, especially the seizures, is this variability, the fluctuation from time to time and day to day. Is there something about FND that makes it so variable compared to other diseases?
Not sure about variable. Life is variable. It changes from second to second, as you know. The brain is constantly working. The mind is constantly working. Unfortunately, I've got one. I'm not sure if it's unfortunate or not, but mine works from the time I wake up until the time I go to sleep. I could wake at 5 in the morning and immediately be in sync with what I want to do. And I could still be on the laptop, or rather more likely on my mobile at 1 the next morning, still 100% engaged in the task. So with FND, there are elements that certainly make accepting everything difficult. My brain fog is one thing, and here I feel there's a lot of parallels with long COVID, and that a lot of the symptoms of long COVID are very, very similar to FND. And probably an unfortunate thing is that FND tends to be seen, or can be seen, as an umbrella. That, well, I don't know what the hell it is, so let's call it FND. It doesn't exactly help, because once you do that, you're consigning in that bucket people who then actually could benefit from what is available if only you understood these various elements, and hence the holistic model again.
So is there a risk that we are moving from not recognizing that there's FND to knowing it's there and it becoming a box that we easily fill in with anything we don't understand or haven't taken the time to do so?
Sure. That's always the risk with anything new. If we find something new, we try and fit it into a pattern of what we already know. Now, in reality, there are very few new things.
That's true. From the narrative, we discussed the onset, which was of the FNDs after this operation. But I wanted to kind of look at one or two things that I thought, could they have been vulnerabilities that made you, or that set you up to developing FND, even though we could identify this traumatic event. And one thing you talked about was your experience when you were about 6 or 7 years old, when you said 2 men tried to groom you.
Oh, yes.
And clearly it was traumatic, because you said 60 years on, it's still fresh in your mind.
Well, yeah, the events were fresh, but in reality, nothing happened. I was completely unaware of the nature of what was happening at the time, save that it wasn't ordinary or normal or usual.
Okay.
And I just dismissed it. And I don't think, on a scale of trauma, it doesn't register very high, very highly for me. Other things, certainly, I've noticed, and many of these traumatic events, not just that, but certainly the breakup of my first marriage, which was almost entirely attributable to my being diagnosed with bipolar, and the loss of my son. I say loss, I didn't see him for over 30 years. That could be traumatic, but I feel I was shielded from that
Okay.
by the autism. But there's also this lack of emotions, almost complete lack of emotions. Now, mine was particularly not discouraged, this lack of emotions. In fact, quite the reverse. Big boys don't cry is a fairly, was or is a fairly common thing that happens. And my father had been brought up by a Victorian grandfather, very proper. He wore a black tie every day after Queen Victoria died, and he didn't die until 1957. So it'll show you the sort of caliber of man he was. But my father also had this, and he had a tendency, he's dead now, but he had a tendency to be very autocratic, and he had his ideas. He's also, I believe, sociopathic in that he didn't give a toot about what anybody else felt. And he hurt a lot of people. And in my case, I was starved of emotions. So none of that did any good for the autism. And so nobody noticed that I was slightly different. So this whole thing about emotions came to a head about 12, 18 months after my FND was triggered. And suddenly it was like a door opening. It was like being blind, and suddenly I can see.
Hmm.
And I had this emotional conversion, like a road to Damascus conversion. They talk about it in the Bible. And suddenly I had emotions. I didn't have any idea. And it's like the notion of a blind man. Well, I can see, but then being said, what color is that? Well, I can see it's a color, and I can see it's different from that color, but I don't know what color is it. It's the same with emotions. I couldn't distinguish between grief, joy, love, or any of these. And the first really deep emotion was love. And my gosh, it's the feeling is, I can tell you, it's very similar to the first time you jump out of an aircraft. What the? Oh! And then quite soon after that was empathy, which I'd never felt, and that was in 65 years.
Hmm.
I never felt for somebody else or how they felt before. That sounds like a pretty shocking thing to admit, but a lot of people go through life like this, and I was going through life like this. And I realized that for the first time that other people feel like this as well. And that was a difficult thing to learn. But it has spurred me to do the work, and sometimes the absurd amount of work that I do for FND Hope, because I believe it's a charity which is helping the wider FND community, and I believe that I can help make a difference. And the other thing, a fairly simple piece of philosophy, two pieces of philosophy. One is it starts with me, and the second is if not me, then who?
So do you think the developing FND opened up this emotions, or was it just incidental?
I don't know whether they're linked, but that's very interesting, a coincidence, because I said that this is all part of a linked experience. The emotions that come out, and having the ability to see these emotions are causing the functional seizures, you can then look at it in a different way and say, well, I'm going to decide through mindfulness, through a conscious decision, I'm not going to rise to the, well, you know what it's like if you're in a relationship, the other party knows the places to go. My wife can't, she knows where to really to dig in the thing. And God bless her, whatever. She does it very nicely. rather more frequently than I'd like, but nevertheless. And all of this together has meant that I was able to stop having, and I have stopped having, functional seizures now for 5 years or something. And that's a material difference in one's life.
And so it looks like a lot of your FND symptoms have resolved partly because of your mindset, which I,
Tremendously.
yeah.
Yes, very much so.
Would you say the problem with mobility is the main issue remaining now? Your balance
Well,
and
the two things, the balance, the mobility, and I'm looking at ways to extend my horizon on that. I keep a journal of everything, my hours of sleep, my blood glucose in the morning, the amount of insulin I take, but also the number of daily steps. And I give myself a target and try and beat it each month. I don't succeed every month, but some months I do. And if I can manage an average of 2,500 steps, that's a mile. So to say, well, I walk a mile a day or 30 miles a month is not bad. But when you consider I'd walk 15, 20 miles a day when I was younger, I did quite a lot of long distance walking. And it's by comparison, I feel that doing what I have to do by really working at it is probably as good for me as, well, that came naturally. So it wasn't actually quite as good. It certainly got me places and I saw some wonderful sights, but now I'm seeing other things. And the other thing is the dysphagia, as I said, food is a paste and of various colors. And the only thing about that is trying to persuade chefs in the restaurant, look, I do actually mean 4 times as much sauce as you would normally put on, or give me a bucket full of custard to put with the pudding and I'll eat it. Or, yeah, I want you to liquidize this wonderful meal. Some do, not all. And that's a sort of limiter. And but for all this, I went to the FND Society meeting in Verona in June with my wife. And for mobility, I took 2 things. One, the electric wheelchair, and secondly, my stroller. On a day-to-day basis, I trolled around in the stroller, and that was quite fun. And but the electric, everything went wrong with that. And turned up at the airport, and they said, well, "Have you got the right paperwork?" No. So we solved that and got on the flight. And then the other end, we met Giuseppe, who was a strict rule. He kept tapping it and get off the and then got lost.
Yeah.
And I ended up driving off the edge of a pavement and falling over. And then we couldn't find, oh, this happened. But after you got through all that, it was great. And all you good guys who take an interest in FND were there, the likes of John Stone and Mark Edwards, you know the name, and Mark Hazlitt, and from the States, and Glenn Nielsen was there as well. I met a huge number of people, and it was wonderful from the point of view of a patient to be talking to representatives around the world about FND and how they treated them. And it was quite interesting that even people who were specialized and specialized enough to come to Verona, to come to Italy, to a conference, still hadn't actually reached into the mindset of somebody with FND. And it's there. And it's the same. I mentioned the younger element of doctor, the younger cadre of doctors, the old doctors, if they've heard of FND, and certainly with seizures, they may and sadly too many of them do, associate him with Freud and his hysteria, which, when you think about it, it goes back to about 2,000 years BC, has been around like forever. I mean, Charcot in the late 18th century, early 19th, and then Freud himself just added fuel to that particular fire. And the difficulty with that is, although there are elements which are right, it ended up as conversion disorder, and now we call it FND. But the doctors still would remember hysteria and the association with the womb. Hysteris is the Greek for womb. And consequently, when a man comes in having seizures, they're more likely to send them to a psychiatrist than to say, this is a neurological problem, I'll send you to a neurologist. Because let's face it, what self-respecting doctor is going to say to a guy, you've got a woman's problem, any more than they go and have a pregnancy test, sir, or you've got endometriosis or dysmenorrhea. It doesn't happen. And it can also explain why there's this imbalance between the number of men, males, diagnosed with FND and the number of females, in that the balance is about 4 to 1, that 80% are female, 20% male. And I think this is probably wholly wrong. It's maybe more balanced than we think. It's just this complete cloud of ignorance, this blanket of general ignorance has meant that there's a whole lot of men who weren't diagnosed properly, won't receive the correct treatment as a result, are misdirected to the wrong treatment, which may help elements, but it doesn't solve the problem. It's treating symptoms, not treating the disease. And that's a great opportunity lost.
Well, I'm hoping your job your job will help to clear the mist and improve.
I hope so. I think that's important, that each one of us in the community, the FND community, has this, if I say duty, because a lot of people feel alone. And that's where the wider FND community comes in, where peer groups like the ones that FND Hope manages and facilitates mean that you get together and you get less of a feeling, I can't solve this. But it's back to the, but I know somebody who might. And it's a great comfort to say, I had a new symptom yesterday, which was, has anybody had this before? And then you get an avalanche of people saying, I've had that. And then what follows from that is, what happens if? Now, example may sound trivial, feet which tingle at night. Now, in my case, I never cover my feet because they're so sensitive. That may not sound like a big deal, but they also tingle almost to the point of hurting. And I found the only thing that helps with that is putting a proprietary gel that's used for muscle, like BioFreeze is the one I use, but there's also, you could use something, an aloe vera based gel of some sort, or one of these similar things. And I feel that calms it down, usually long enough for me to fall asleep, which then by the time I've reset in the morning, it's not a problem. But that might just help somebody whose symptoms are exacerbated by fatigue. And it's this shared community wisdom that is such a use to, so again, the wider FND community, plus podcasts like this. You're not alone. Somebody is listening. Somebody does care. somebody's doing something about it. And that is very, very comforting.
And how much does FND Hope bring the FND community together with the specialists working on it? I know you attend the meetings with them, but how close is that link between?
Yeah, quite close. I think we got a team of specialists within FND. In fact, there's a medical advisory committee or board, I think they call themselves, with some names I mentioned before: John Stone, Mark Edwards, and Mark Hazlitt, as I said, in the States. And I think Kurt LaFrance might be on it. And if you went through the top 20 people who have published matters about FND, you'll find a lot of names there. Catherine Lefebvre is another one. And there's a couple in Australia doing great work as well. And they are part of a resource that FND Hope, through the years, has been able to build up and to pitch ideas at. They don't always get it right. I'll be quite candid. Occasionally, one of them makes a howler or makes an assumption which isn't the greatest, but nevertheless, there is quite a good, I won't say fallback, it isn't a fallback. It's a resource which can be used and used to buttress what we have as peers as such. And I'm very grateful for that.
Because as some neurologists in the UK, when we diagnose a patient and kind of trying to get them to know a bit about it, we refer to John Stone's website, neurosymptoms.org.
Neurosymptoms.org, yes. And
Yeah.
not just the website, I've got it on my phone and I refer to it quite a lot. So it's there, but John is a very good expert. I've spoken to him a couple of times and calls like this and so on. But and Mark Edwards is another great person, very approachable. And I've never heard somebody say, well, I went to see him and he wasn't much good. But what they do say is he listens.
Which is 90% of what is needed.
That's the key. That's the key. He takes the time to listen.
One thing you mentioned, which is within the theme of the ignorance, is that there is far more knowledge and understanding of FND among physiotherapists and occupational therapists more than doctors. What is it that they're getting right that physicians can?
They see the patient. And it's the same with, let me think, physios, speech and language, occasionally occupation therapists. I can't say anything against occupation therapists, as my wife is a retired OT, and she's very good at looking at the cause and looking at the person, to the extent that she's ramping up to do some. She's done a couple of sessions online for FND Hope Ireland on visual imagery as such, and that's great relaxation. Went down very well. And she'd like to do some reframing, but it'd have to be to somebody who's very suitable and so on. With the physios, they don't look at somebody with a diagnosis of FND.
Okay.
They tend to look at somebody who's got a gait disorder and say, I know a bit about gait disorders because I've got a client who has Parkinson's and another client who's had a stroke. So why should we be any different? The gait, the disorder, is part of the picture of FND, and they treat the person's disorder rather than their diagnosis. Same with OTs. What do you need to do to achieve your activities of daily living? Well, I can't walk. Well, have you tried crutches? Yes, but well, what about a stroller? Okay, how about a wheelchair? We don't like to because, and so adaptive eating, weighted, weighted cutlery and things like that.
Okay. We touched earlier a bit about stigma regarding bipolar.
Oh,
Um,
yes.
and you also talked about it in the context of FND. And one of the things you talked about is also the isolation. Are they together? You felt isolated from friends and neighbors, and even you said your family evaporated swiftly. Is that all linked to the stigma, or is it partly because you were isolating yourself because of FND?
Uh, Probably not the latter in my case. I once mentioned to a neighbor in a fairly closed community, 5 houses, converted barns, and I mentioned to him that I was bipolar. I was completely cut off.
Hmm.
And they had a summer party outside and a barbecue, and we weren't invited. Yeah, it was 10 yards from my back gate. And there they were shouting, screaming, getting drunk together and so on. And we weren't even invited. So it's much the same with FND that the first sign is, oh, if you ever want anything, we'll be there for you. Then you ask them, could you be there for me? Oh, sorry, I've got as Oscar Wilde put it, I've remembered a subsequent engagement, which happens all too often. And I saw people who've been friends for 5, 6, 7, 8 years drift off into the never hear from them again. And this is very common. And I'm not alone. I've seen other people say this, and only in the last week I've been following threads of conversations on the peer groups. And a lot of people say, well, my family disowned me. And they believe it's a made up symptoms. They won't listen to the explanation. They don't want to understand. They can't. They don't seem to be able to expand their ability to embrace a condition which isn't well defined, which isn't well known, and to take a leap of faith and say, well, yes, I recognize there's something wrong, that you have no physical proof that it's wrong, like an MRI or a CT scan or anything else. But for the Hoover's test, you can't point at anything, or an fMRI may show some changes in the white matter, but it's tiny compared to, say, if you've got a broken leg and bits of bone are sticking out here. Oh yeah, I know why you limp. It's because and so it's difficult, and also this spectrum of it being a mental disorder, and mental disorders always throw people.
Yeah. Yeah, does it work the other way around where people try not to get the diagnosis or don't want to be given a diagnosis of FND, knowing that the stigma is out there? Have you found that in your work where people fight against the diagnosis to be
Now,
given?
I find quite the reverse, in that a lot of people, again through the peer groups, say, well, I've suffered these symptoms for 25 years, or 10 years, or 5 years. I got a diagnosis last week, and I'm so pleased. You mentioned professionals. I'll mention another name, Chris Simeon. Never come across that guy. That man could walk on water. He's that good, because he took a point. He's a neuropsychiatrist and neuropsychologist. He made a point of sending me a private message with his personal phone number to say, if you're having difficulty getting over the gems and so on, and he knew how close Richard was one of his patients, you can contact me and talk. And it's that closeness that I found so comforting and so unexpected and so welcoming.
I can see why there's hope in the name. Um,
Hope is everything. It may be the only thing you've got.
and regarding hope, what are the prospects of whatever is left of your FND getting better, or even dare to talk about
Well,
cure?
statistically, they reckon it's threes. You get about a third will deteriorate. A third of the patients will deteriorate over the years. The symptoms will gradually add up. About a third will naturally get better. And then there's a third in the middle are going to stay the same. So you could be lucky in the lottery and be in the getting better group, or you can fight and make sure that you can do everything you can do to get better. But at present, a lot of people say, well, I haven't had symptoms for 2-3 years. And then you get others. I didn't have symptoms for 2 or 3 years, but I had my first seizure again last week, or the gait disorder came back suddenly last week. Now, you can look at it as an unresolved issue with the past. You can look at it as in remission in the interim, or any number of other ways. But nevertheless, it is a reality that it is a chronic, incurable, lifelong condition. But I got several of those already. I seem to be like, I've got about 5 of them now, including good sense of humor, which, you know.
And what does the future hold for FND? One of the things you talked about was some of the findings on imaging in people with FND. I did wonder how much is cause, how much is effect. But what does the future hold in
Yeah,
understanding and curing or treating?
yeah. I think there are several areas which have possibilities. There's no stronger than that. For example, a lot of old-time remedies were good. One of the things that I know in Australia, they've done this, they've had 2 or 3 very good research projects done into the use of psilocin, which is hallucinogenic, or more commonly known as magic mushrooms, liberty cat mushrooms, you name it. And they've used that as an adjunct to other therapies. And I know at least one person who's gone through an experimental course of treatment with psilocin, with the mushrooms, whose gait improved such that she could walk, and had walked like she hadn't walked in 6, 7, 8 years. So that gives a sort of idea. And the use of other things like ketamine, which is a street drug, K, I think it's called, or Super K, or something like that. And they use that with CBT, in that if you can make the mind more susceptible to change and to accepting things like believing that you can walk, like not believing you're going to fall when you're in a state, same with a lysergide, it'll do the same. It makes you more susceptible, which is in excess, you'll get the hallucinations and all the rest of it. But that's not the point. It isn't. You want to get somewhere between the two, and that will improve the symptom, but also it'll improve the way the mind is reacting with the brain. And in other ways, the long COVID research is very popular at present. I'm seeing, well, in the last 3 years, I've probably seen 300 research reports. Seriously, 300 research reports. There's been a similar number over the years on medical marijuana, which has been used for seizures, and most popularly recently with epilepsy and epileptic seizures. It's been calmed down. So there's a lot of medical reports, but at present there isn't enough evidence-supported, peer-supported research for the professionals to say, yeah, so for the future, my hope is that the cudgel, the banner for FND will be taken up by people much smarter than I am, who are trained doctors, neurologists, researchers, wishing to advance the boundaries of science and the application of science for the benefit of the FND community.
Okay, we've explored quite a few things. There's a lot more in the book, but I think at the risk of taking more of your time, I'll just ask one last question. Are there any books you would like to recommend regarding either FND or the brain or anything?
There's quite a few, one of which comes to mind, and that's I'm ashamed to say I can't remember the name of the authoress. She was if I can explain why it was. This was a neuroscientist who had a stroke, and it took away about a third or more of one of the hemispheres in her mind. And she was quite conscious of the way the stroke developed. And it left her unable to communicate except in basic terms. She also had the good fortune of having a mother who was also a neuroscientist. And over about 5 years, she learned through neuroplasticity to use the other hemisphere of the brain. She just passed over those things and so learned speech and so on, all of these things together. The book is entitled A Stroke of Inspiration, I think.
My Stroke of Insight, I think.
Insight, stroke.
Jill Bolte Taylor, is it?
It's phenomenal, isn't it? As a survival story, it's gripping.
Yeah, it's an excellent book. I've actually invited her as a guest on this podcast.
Great.
So,
great.
Yeah, glad that somebody has recommended the book.
Oh, very much so, very much. I would think she'd be a fascinating person to sit down and have a good chat with.
Okay, that's one. 2 more books, if you can.
Well, my book.
Yes, your book is on top.
I say there are lots that I've learned little things from. John Cabot-Stone's the whole catastrophe, which he talks about mindfulness, and it's a quite thick tome like that. About the first third is very useful because he discusses why mindfulness and so on is so important and applying it to our lives. And the whole catastrophe, incidentally, is from Zorba the Greek, in that apparently he said he got married and had children. He said, I had the whole catastrophe. And that's how Kabat-Zinn described that. Now, as for a third, there are probably half a dozen that I've looked at and I've read, and some I look at again and again. The body remembers, I think, well, the brain remembers, I think, is one, and there's a couple of others. Okay. If I went through the bookshelf behind, you'd find it dotted around. Gray's Anatomy is well thumbed and that sort of thing.
Well, Robert, thank you very much for participating in this episode of the podcast. I've really enjoyed talking to you and learning a lot about FND. As you well know, something.
Thanks for being invited, Ibrahim, and it's. I certainly hope that we will meet face to face sometime in the future.
Hopefully in the near future, yes.
It would be very nice. I certainly would welcome that indeed.
Without the computer and the Zoom.
Oh! I'll hit the desk and we can wipe out the camera again if you like.
But to my audience who will have to be watching this on the screen, thank you very much for watching or listening to the podcast. If you found it interesting, do get Robert's book. And after that, I have a book called Surfing the Brain you might want to check out. And for some academic aspects of neurology, I have a website called Neuro Checklist. And to make sure you don't miss the next episode of the podcast, why not subscribe to the YouTube, iTunes, or Spotify channels? But until the next episode, thank you very much. And Robert, I'm very, very grateful for your time.
Thank you.